Hi, my name is Phillip Hedayatnia, and I'm a rising senior at Hawken School in Cleveland, Ohio. And I'm going to be giving you an overview of Legislation P1, a bill to ban direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs at the 2015 NSDA National Tournament. So I'm just going to give you first an overview of the bill, and then we're going to move on to arguments. So first, this is what the bill very simply does. It bans the advertising of prescription drugs or the direct-to-consumer advertising, so Merck or whatever pharmaceutical company advertising to people, over the television. So it bans all that on television and radio. And direct-to-consumer advertising is defined as a form of marketing promotion that is aimed towards the patient or consumer rather than healthcare professionals. And then the FDA oversees implementation. It takes effect on January 1st, 2016. That's what the bill does very simply. Now, I just want to make something also clear as well. The affirmative is going to hinge on a few things. The affirmative is going to hinge on a few things, and here's what it's going to hinge on. It's going to hinge on the fact that by banning direct-to-consumer advertising of prescription drugs, you're going to stop people from taking drugs that they don't really need. So what happens right now is that people, they see an ad for a particular drug on their television, they end up getting scared into buying the drug, or into going and asking their doctor for the drug. And you may wonder, well, if they're asking their doctor, why wouldn't their doctor just say no? That's actually not so simple, because in many cases, doctors actually feel a lot of pressure to provide these drugs to people. They worry that people will then go and just say, he's not giving me the drug I need, let me switch to another doctor. That actually has happened, so it's a real concern for doctors, and so doctors end up giving out prescription drugs that they really probably shouldn't. So that's where direct-to-consumer advertising can be pretty harmful. However, there's a lot of neg points on this bill, because this bill is probably more bad than it is good, and here's what I mean by that. First of all, it's very easy to run the point that it's going to be defying the U.S. Constitution, because here you're banning a form of advertising, which it means essentially that you're banning a form of speech. So that's something that's pretty difficult. To really convince people that your point is worth it if you're on the affirmative, you have to essentially be able to make the argument that the threat to humanity of direct-to-consumer advertising is so great that it's worth kind of making an exception. Like what we do with freedom of speech in regard to if you shout fire in a crowded theater. Well, that's not protected free speech. But the reason why it's not protected free speech is because if you're shouting fire in a crowded theater, everybody's going to go into panic, and then people could die. So, that's a real reason. I think it's really hard to argue that direct-to-consumer advertising is such a huge problem that it's worth, in a way, kind of molding the U.S. Constitution a little bit. And it is possible to run that point, but you have to have a very compelling case of direct-to-consumer advertising being extremely harmful to health. Additionally, there are a lot of law professors that claim that this is an assault on free speech, and you should also look at Bates versus the State Bar of Arizona, which set a sort of legal precedent for this sort of advertising. You really can't ban it. You can restrict it. You can say that we need to send it through the FDA for approval or something like that, but you really can't ban it. There's also the fact that banning them could actually harm the average consumer, because there's a lot of studies that say this, including one by the Center for Policy Studies, that argues that prescription drug ads are actually really good, because what happens is now you have people who are then like, oh wow, those are the symptoms, I might actually have this disease, and then they go into their doctor's office and they start asking the questions. So then you have people diagnosed who maybe might not have been diagnosed otherwise, which actually leads to people being healthier in the long run. And this is actually very, very true. The Journal of the American Medical Association published a report where they looked at New Mexico. New Mexico was a state where a ban on prescription drugs was actually piloted, and they found that the doctors actually saw a 25% reduction in the number of successful matches between patients and a prescription drug that could have assisted their health. So essentially you see that banning these drugs can actually hurt the consumer in terms of hurt them health-wise. And then the other thing is, reform, don't remove. So what I mean by that is, currently the FDA has to approve ads, but many times the ads can go on air before they've really been approved. that's part of the reason why ads can go on air that are actually very misleading. And so a drug that really shouldn't be advertised for weight loss, for example, might be advertised for weight loss. So that's something that's pretty bad. But that's something where just creating FDA reform. So you can argue that on the affirmative, that like there are all these drugs being peddled that shouldn't be peddled. But at the same time, the negative has a very easy counter to that, which is that why don't we just reform the way the FDA works? That solves the problems. The other thing as well is that the vast majority of advertising spending by prescription drug companies is actually not spent on the consumer at all. The drug companies actually don't gain that much from advertising to the consumer. What they gain the most from is advertising to doctors, advertising to healthcare professionals. And again, look at the episode of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver where he talks about that, because it's a really good episode for a reason. It shows how many of these doctors are giving people medications that they may not even need, not because they're asking for it, but because doctors are receiving money and benefits and free food and all this sort of stuff from the prescription drug companies, and because the prescription drug companies have the ability to go and look and say, this doctor isn't referring as many patients to our medication, we should pay him a visit. That sort of stuff does not end if you pass today's legislation, which means you're not actually going to be solving for the things that the affirmative speaks about when they talk about how, how there's going to be health issues and stuff like that, because you're not ending the almost bribery of doctors. Because that isn't ending, like, that point, that rebuttal that I just made can easily wipe out many of the affirmative points. So it's much easier to go negation on this. However, it's going to be easier for everyone to go negation on this, which means if you can try to prepare better affirmative points, that's really great. Do I think this legislation is going to come up? I think maybe. Maybe is my answer. It is not going to be top of the docket. I'd be very surprised if it is. But I don't think... I think it's interesting enough that people are going to want to debate it, and so they're going to want to push it up at least to one of the last sessions at the very least. So it's a bill that's worth prepping. The other thing is many districts around the country have debated this at locals, mine included. So this is also something that a lot of people have experience with, which may be a reason why they want to advance the bill with debate. So that's really all I have to say on DTC advertising of prescription drugs. The essential points in the bill it's going to revolve around whether or not you can ban the advertisements. It's going to revolve around the effectiveness of doing so. And those studies that I mentioned are pretty important. You can look at the effects. If people aren't coming into their doctor's offices at all, that's something that's worse for human health. And so that's something that you can definitely weigh within the round. Thanks for watching.